Hey everyone, it's Scott from certmedia.com, and in this video I'm going to be covering Webcraftic Clearfy. It is a WordPress optimization plugin that has a lot of downloads, and I've been asked about it, so that's why I'm going to be reviewing it. I'm going to go over it because I see it used a lot, but I have some mixed feelings about it, and I'm going to explain that towards the end. So you go ahead and you install it, and you get a nice little button here that allows you to go to the settings panel, and you get a settings panel. This plugin is a monster of options. And the problem with a lot of options is a lot of users don't know how to use them. And I run across this all the time when I'm asked to look into a website and I see them using this plugin and they don't know why they're using the plugin. The plugin has so much built into it that its purpose is almost pointless. It was supposed to originally be some sort of optimization plugin, kind of like Perfmatters, with a lot worse user interface, but has so much more stuff in it that it's overwhelming. So we're going to break it down, and we're not even going to touch the quick start screen. Do not touch the quick start. We're just going to break down each of the different panels. So the performance section. A lot of the options in here have zero to do with your performance at all. Disable RSS feeds. This will prevent you from having RSS feeds on the website. It's pretty straightforward. Removing the REST API links. This can cause breakage if you're using a app or service that requires access to the REST API. Disable emojis. This removes Emojis.js. That's a good thing to have, but I wouldn't install this plugin to do just that. Remove Jquery migrate. This is a good suggestion as well. Most websites don't need the current version of Jquery migrate that is used in core, so long as it's been updated recently. If you're not running a theme from 2010, you probably don't need to worry about Jquery migrate. You can disable WordPress embeds. This removes the script that was added in 4.4 that allows websites to embed your website on them. It's a pretty niche feature, but I enjoy it. If you don't have any use for it, you can turn this feature on. Remove the really simple discovery link. That's fine. You're not going to get any performance improvements at all, but go ahead and remove it. You can remove XFN profile link. This just is mostly meant to help with spam. A lot of bots will try to use it. It's the little link. Yeah, there it is. The link rel profile XFN 11. You don't really need to turn that off, and it's not going to really impact your performance. It's probably not going to stop any bots either, but it's an option. You can remove the Windows Live Reader manifest. If you're not using Windows Live Writer, go ahead and disable it. Remove the short link, which is a little link that WordPress will add in the header if you have Jetpack enabled or you're running a really old version of WordPress. That includes a shortened wp.me link to the current URL that the user is looking at. You can remove the link to previous and next post option here. You can remove the recent comments CSS style for the recent comments CSS for the widget. You can load Font Awesome asynchronously. Now this is an interesting option. I would just not use this plugin to handle it. Loading Font Awesome in a non-render blocking way is totally acceptable for most websites, even if you don't have critical CSS. And the primary reason for that is Font Awesome doesn't really render anything mission critical. The only time I imagine that you would need Font Awesome to be rendered right away, if you don't have critical CSS on the website, is if you're using it for mobile devices as the hamburger menu icon, in which case you need that icon readily available so users have a means of accessing the menu. So for most websites, go ahead and try it, see how you like it. But I just wouldn't use this plugin for this feature. Use a proper optimization plugin, no matter what you use. Autoptimize, Swift, WordPress Rocket, WordPress Fastest Cache. There's a myriad of options. I've covered almost all of them by now. They're all great options. I wouldn't use this plugin to do this because it can interfere too if they're trying to combine your CSS. This can cause that process to fail or to get some really weird side effects that I've noticed sometimes. So I wouldn't use this option for that. You could disable the dash icons, which is actually a good thing. Most websites don't need dash icons on the front end so long as the user is not logged in. Perfmatters has this option and I love it. Most websites simply don't need dash icons because they're using Font Awesome. And by disabling it for those users, you're saving 30 kilobytes of compressed CSS. That doesn't sound like a lot, but my entire homepage on my website is about 30 kilobytes of CSS. So that's half of what I'm delivering to the user for an icon font that I'm not even using. So that's something to keep in mind. You can disable gravatars. Gravatars, I actually recommend you enable them. I do wish that more plugins had gravatar caching, which is where the plugin goes out and downloads the actual icon and saves them on the server. That way you can set the expires headers. But there's no real reason to disable gravatars nowadays because you have a myriad of ways to lazy load the images or to cache them locally. And I will do a video on a plugin that can cache them locally because that is a real thing that you should worry about if you're running a very popular website that gets a lot of comments. You can choose to disable revisions. Post revisions can be an issue if you let them get too far out of whack. I actually delete my revisions on a regular basis, so long as I know I don't have anything in draft. And the reason for this is every time you make a post, let's say you go into a post and you have a 500 word post and you edit a word that you misspelled and you click the update button. Well, now you effectively have two exact versions of that same post saved in the database, which is a waste. You're adding more bloat to the database that isn't necessary, which can then impact your performance. If you're really curious, try using a plugin like WP Sweep to run through and clean out the revisions or just to see how many you have. And you could be amazed on how much has collected on a few months or a few years old of a website. You could choose to limit the WordPress post revisions to any number that's included in here, which I do recommend. That way you don't get too large. I see websites that have like 100 revisions for their posts, and I'm just like, that is not necessary. Set them to something like 15 to stop them from getting too crazy, but also make sure that you're cleaning them out regularly. You can modify the Gutenberg autosave control. There's no real option for you to. There's no real reason for you to ever do that. You can remove query strings from scripts and style sheets. I recommend that option is on. Mostly just because it makes the files cleaner. If you're using any kind of plugin to combine the CSS though, it will do that automatically. Then you have a limited version of Heartbeat control here. You can choose to disable Heartbeat API either on everywhere, only on the dashboard page, or only allow when editing posts and pages. I would just modify the heartbeat frequency to be 500 seconds, the highest interval it allows. That way, users are not hammering your server if you're working on the back end and editing something, and it just keeps the website running smoothly. You have Minify options in here, and I'm just going to say this right now. I don't want to touch this option too much because it's not a plugin that's really meant to handle it, but you can go ahead and optimize your HTML code. Make sure you remove HTML comments. You make sure the option is off. You can enable JavaScript, which will enable the functionality for them to be optimized. You can then aggregate the JavaScript file, which will combine them. And you can exclude the scripts here. If you're somebody who's used Autoptimize, this looks exactly like a Carbon knockoff. It's a complete Carbon copy of the features, down to the naming conventions, with a little question mark for some extra. This is another issue that I have with plugins like this, is they effectively exist just to knock off other plugins, which I'm not a fan of. So just to reiterate, for the auto-optimize options, you would go like this for the JS options, and then you would come over here and then you enable data URIs. And then if you have the ability to enable inline and defer CSS and you have critical CSS generated, you can do so. I wouldn't worry about this though for most configurations. Asset Manager. I'm not going to spend too much time on the Asset Manager, but basically it allows you to disable and enable CSS and JS on certain pages from certain plugins and to load them only when they're necessary. This is very similar to what Perfmatters offers. It just does it in a lot clunkier user interface in my opinion, but it is an option that exists. And you can go through and we could play with it a little bit. What we'll do is we will enable it on the front end, and I'll edit a post just to show you. Let's see, Asset Manager. So on the free version, It'll tell you the total size of the page is 207 kilobytes. It says there's no plugins that are found. You can go to the miscellaneous and you can choose to enable and disable it if it's not being used on the page, and then you click save. The more plugins you have, or the more that it's being loaded from the theme, the more that will show up that you can configure to enable and disable. For the Google Services option, you could choose to cache Google Analytics locally. It will ask you to put your Google Analytics ID here, and you can modify some of the basic settings. This is not something like WordPress Rocket, which will automatically optimize your existing Google Analytics tags. This completely overwrites anything you've been using up until this point. For the Fonts and Maps option, you could choose to load Google Fonts asynchronously, to disable Google Fonts altogether. While doing this will improve the performance, you're going to lose any of the fancy fonts that you've been using on the front end of your website. And then you can choose to disable Google Maps, which you should only use if for some reason your theme is loading the Google Maps API, even though you don't have an API key enabled. But if you do disable it and you need the API key and the API.js, then the functionality will just no longer work. There is built-in image optimization, which is from the Robin Image Optimizer component, which is just another plugin they made to compress your images. It's comparable to... It's kind of like WordPress Smush. It'll send the images to their server. They will do the compression, and then it will send it back. I don't see a real reason to use this whole plugin for the Robin Image Optimizer component, but I'll cover Robin Image Optimizer in another video. For the SEO section, most of these don't do anything. So basic SEO optimization options, it will automatically set the alt tag attribute. I don't ever recommend doing this. Don't ever set your alt attributes automatically, because it's not going to be something particularly useful to the user. So what it says is the alt attribute is mandatory. If you missed or null, it will automatically be assigned and will be equal to the title of the article. So if you have an article called Hello World and you have 5 images in there where you didn't write an alt tag, regardless of the content of the images, they're just going to say Hello World. That doesn't do anything for anybody who actually needs alt attributes, because what it's primarily for is for screen readers. So if you just have 5 images that just say the title of the post, that doesn't do anything for them, which makes this option really bad. I'm not a fan of something like this, and I'm definitely not a fan of image SEO plugins that automatically add these attributes. You can create a robots.txt file. It says create the right. WordPress does not create a real robots.txt file, so this just creates a robots.txt file. They say it's perfect, and oh, look at this. It's copied from Yoast SEO. So there's the option. It's basically a blank SEO. It's a blank robots.txt, which is honestly all that you should have, unless you want to throw the sitemap in there for some weird reason. One thing that you can do is automatically add a last modified header and a return an if modified since response header. This is a more complicated option. I don't recommend enabling this for most cases. What this does is it tells the browser that, hey, the HTML can be cached, because it'll get a header that says, well, this was last modified, let's just say 2 days ago. And the browser revisits it. Well, it's already got it in cache then, so it doesn't need to re-download that HTML, because it can just fetch it from cache, because the server says, oh, well, it obviously hasn't been updated, so it doesn't need to be it doesn't need to return the new headers, so that way it's re-downloaded. The issue here comes down to 2 primary issues you'll run into. Number 1, the server doesn't properly send these headers. Happens a lot more than some hosts would probably be willing to admit. The other issue is detecting when the header should be updated. If you have a homepage where it's just showing your blog post in a nice orderly fashion, what could happen is you make a new post, but the homepage doesn't recognize that as being updated. So the plugin will not update the last modified header, which then in turn means that your post will not show up on the homepage, but if they go to the post page directly, it'll download like normal. So you can just cause some really weird interactions with your website. And if you're just caching your HTML anyways using a caching plugin or something like Varnish, you don't need this option. Duplicate pages. This is another option that allows you to just delete duplicate pages, like author archives, date archives. Any good SEO plugin will come with these options, so I wouldn't go using this plugin for SEO options. You should never use attachment pages. They should be redirected. You should never have your date archives indexed because they're basically just useless pages filled with a single copy of your post that was published that day, and so on and so forth. I wouldn't use this option. I would just let your Yoast SEO handle it and not even worry about it. We already went through the configuration for Yoast SEO. This is just redundancy. The comments option allows you to disable comments everywhere, only on certain post types like pages and media. And then you can use persistent mode. What this will do is it will make changes to the database. And what this means is if you disable this plugin later, because this mode modifies the database setting, it will continue to be disabled even in the event of you updating or disabling the plugin or updating the post. So you would have to go through each post that this plugin modified and reactivate it in the post settings. Not a very good thing to do because it makes adding comments back later incredibly difficult. You can remove the site field in the comment form. This is a good thing to do. The site URL is honestly where most of your spam is coming from because people are just going to be injecting their URL in there to try and get a cheap backlink and maybe some traffic. You could just replace external links in comments on the JavaScript code. So as it mentions right here, it'll replace where somebody says a ahref yourdomain.com rel equals nofollow, and it will deal with them and it will replace them, and so on and so forth. Comments cleaner basically just allows you to go through and delete comments from all your post types. You can delete spam comments, unapproved comments, and trashed comments, just like any optimization plugin like WP Sweep. The updates field allows you to enable auto updates, disable updates, and so on and so forth. This is basically Easy Updates Manager, but thrown into the plugin. I would be really surprised if there was, I wouldn't be that surprised if there was code in here from Easy Updates Manager. But you can disable and enable updates, so on and so forth, or enable auto updates. My stance is you should keep your plugins and themes up to date, but you should never set them to auto update. Even the best plugins, Yoast SEO, Woocommerce, release really bad updates sometimes. Even a recent version of Woocommerce 4.0 caused me several headaches where client sites were just knocked offline from a PHP error, and I rolled them back to the last version of 3.9, and I waited until 4.0.1 came out and it fixed the issues. So you should never auto update unless you have a really good plan for redundancy and a good means of fixing it. But I'm not going to touch on this option too much because it's just enabling and modifying them on a per plugin, per theme basis. The defense section is mostly superfluous. It's not going to replace proper security settings. You can disable XML RPC. I've made a video on Cloudflare that covers how you can block XML RPC access from everything that isn't Jetpack. You can hide errors when logging into the website. This is an interesting feature. So when you log into WordPress, and let's say you just guess a username. Let's say you type in admin, but there's no username as admin. It'll say blah, 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 blah. That username doesn't exist. Or if you guess the username correctly, let's say it's Scott, and then you put an incorrect password in, it'll say, this password does not match what we have on file for Scott, something along those lines. This will just disable that notice. It kind of helps if somebody's manually trying to brute force their way in. But most people don't manually brute force their way in. They use a bot that goes through and checks a list of hacked websites and guess the username and the password on your own. You could choose to remove the HTML comment for the WordPress version. I do recommend this is used, but I wouldn't install this plugin just to do that. It's one line of PHP. And then you could choose to remove HTML comments fully from the source code, which can be useful if your theme comments stuff out or it uses it for self-promotion. You can install the hide login page component, which will rename the WordPress login URL. I've covered my thoughts on it on another video, but basically I don't like to do this because it interferes with themes and plugins more times than I would like, but also it doesn't really fix the problem that it's trying to solve, because users will go to the URL and get sent to a 404 page. Oftentimes 404 pages are never cached, so your server is still consuming a large amount of resources. You have the widgets option. You can actually enable and disable every single widget here. This will basically just reduce the amount of database queries that are done, but it's not going to do that much for you. Really, if you're trying to optimize the website, disabling the default core widgets is one of the last things that I would be concerned about. It's something that does cause a lot of issues, believe it or not, is the WooCommerce status widget on the dashboard. And I have a helper plugin that I've written that covers that. But basically that plugin, because it has to aggregate on very large websites a bunch of order data, and then it has to figure out if it's in the correct time period, it causes a large amount of database queries that can take several seconds to process if you're not using Redis, or you just have so much data that it's causing a cache slam. So I always turn that widget off. And Perfmatters has a functionality that does that as well. Under the advanced, this is just silly things in my opinion. You can hide admin notices. You can hide all notices outright. You could choose to enable hidden notices in the admin bar. I don't really care about admin notices too much. I get them from plugins. I click the check mark and they go away. I've never had a notice stay around that I haven't wanted. So I don't really mess with this option too much. The components is honestly just a list of other plugins they have written or own or have broken functionality out of this plugin and put it in their own plugin. So it's an interesting functionality. I just wouldn't worry. It's just self-promotion. The more people that download it, the more people who get converted to buy the premium ones. And then the license for the pro version gets inserted here. And that allows you to get the business functionality, which unlocks some additional tools that we saw at least in the easy updates functionality, and so on and so forth. This plugin is honestly just a lot, and my fundamental issue with it is it's so much that it's really hard to use. For instance, the performance section basically has knockoff auto-optimize functionality. There is no performance benefit of you combining 40 plugins into one and then just putting it in your own wrapper instead of just using the 40 plugins individually. And a lot of these features are really ripped out of other plugins. The performance section honestly looks like they just copied Auto-Optimize completely. Like it's a complete and utter ripoff. And I do like to support the developers who do the initial work. There are some other plugins out there who do copy Auto-Optimize. I will not speak of them, but it is common knowledge in the spheres of influence, if you would, who know some plugins do knock off each other. This is one of those plugins. But my other issue is a lot of the functionality just doesn't do anything for your performance. And I'd rather you get a plugin that has a much cleaner user interface, like Perfmatters, but you have to pay a little bit, than to get a free plugin that is so overwhelming with options that you just click the do it for me button and hope that it does everything okay and that it doesn't cause problems. And that's my thoughts on the plugin. I wouldn't recommend you use it. If you have to use something like this, just find little plugins or little snippets that can do what you want, or pay for Perfmatters and get better user interface, quite frankly. If you have any questions about any specific options, I can help you in the comments below. Unfortunately, I have a lot more experience with this plugin than I would like to admit, but clients do seem to love it. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching, and goodbye.